I used to think that ghost stories were just something people told to make the night feel a little less empty. I'd laugh when someone said their house was haunted, because deep down, I figured people just needed an excuse for creaking floors or bad wiring. That changed the summer I moved to Coldwater, a tiny town in southern Indiana that didn't even have a traffic light. You could blink and miss it. I moved there in 2017 after my divorce, trying to start over somewhere quiet, somewhere I could afford. I didn't realize at the time that quiet can turn into something else entirely when you're the only one around to hear it. The house I rented sat at the edge of a cornfield, the kind of place that looked peaceful in the realtor's photos: big porch, old maple tree in the front yard, wide open sky stretching forever. But when I first arrived, the air felt strange, like the land itself was holding its breath. My nearest neighbor lived half a mile away. I told myself that was perfect. I wanted solitude, I wanted peace, and for the first few weeks, that's what I got. The first odd thing happened in early June. I was unpacking boxes in the living room when I heard the front door open, the old hinges whining. I figured maybe I hadn't closed it tight, but when I went to check, it was shut, the bolt in place. The air smelled different though, a little colder, like after a thunderstorm. I remember standing there for a long time, my hand on the doorknob, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did. So I laughed at myself, told myself it was just the house settling, but the noises continued. Footsteps, sometimes soft like a child walking barefoot on the hardwood, other times heavy, slow, deliberate, always in the hallway between my bedroom and the bathroom. I started leaving a lamp on at night because I hated that hallway, narrow, dark, and lined with faded wallpaper that peeled near the ceiling. At night, the patterns looked like faces. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe animals in the walls, I thought. It was an old house. But then one night, around 2 a.m., I woke up because the hallway light was flickering. I hadn't left it on. I never did, because the bulb always buzzed like a dying insect. When I looked through the cracked open door, I saw someone standing there, or something that looked like someone, a silhouette, tall, motionless. I froze. The light blinked again, and when it steadied, the hallway was empty. My chest hurt like I'd been holding my breath too long. The next morning, I convinced myself it was a dream. Stress, exhaustion, loneliness, all good explanations. I even told a coworker about it, laughing it off. She didn't laugh, though. She just said, "You're in the old Keller place, right?" I nodded. Her face changed, like she wanted to say more, but didn't know how. Finally, she said, "That house has a story. You should talk to Sheriff Brandt if you're curious." Then she went back to her sandwich like we hadn't just talked about ghosts at lunch. I didn't ask her more that day, but curiosity is a dangerous thing. That weekend, I stopped by the sheriff's office. Brandt was an older man, late 60s, slow-talking, with that kind of patience you only find in people who've lived in the same town their whole lives. When I asked him about the Keller place, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You've been hearing things, haven't you?" he said. "You wouldn't be the first. Family that owned it disappeared in the 70s. Father, mother, 2 kids, never found. Some folks say they left in the middle of the night. Others think the land swallowed them. All I know is no one stays long in that house." I felt stupid standing there, like a kid scared of her own shadow. But something in his voice made me uneasy. It wasn't superstition, it was resignation, like he'd accepted something he couldn't explain. After that talk, I tried not to think about it, but the house wouldn't let me forget. One night, while brushing my teeth, I heard whispering in the hallway, not voices exactly, more like breath, soft and rhythmic, right outside the door. I opened it fast, expecting to catch someone, but the hall was empty. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. The wallpaper on one side had dark stains running down it, like water damage. Except the house hadn't leaked once since I'd moved in. When I leaned closer, I realized the marks formed faint handprints, small ones, about the size of a child's. That night, I barely slept. Every time I drifted off, I dreamed of that hallway endless, stretching farther than the house itself. At the end, there was always a door I didn't remember seeing before, and something behind it knocking softly, over and over. 2 days later, I found the door. It wasn't in my dream this time, it was real, behind the linen closet. When I pulled the shelves aside, there was a wooden door hidden in the wall, painted the same color as the plaster. The knob was rusted, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I should have called someone. I should have stopped right there, but I didn't. Inside was a narrow staircase leading down to a small cellar. Not a basement, just a dirt-floored room with no light except what I brought with me. The air was thick, wet, and smelled like something long dead. I almost turned back. Then, my flashlight beam landed on something hanging from the ceiling, a child's shoe covered in dust. Beneath it, half buried in the dirt, was a glass jar filled with yellowed paper. I picked it up. Inside were folded notes, maybe 10 or 12 of them, written in a child's handwriting. I opened one. It said, "He comes when it's quiet." That was all. I left the cellar shaking. That night, I called my sister in Chicago, told her I was thinking of moving back. She told me I was being dramatic. I didn't tell her about the jar, or the whispers, or the shape in the hallway. I didn't tell anyone after that. The next few days blurred together. I started hearing scratching sounds in the walls, always around the same time, just before dawn. My dog, who never barked before, started growling at corners. Sometimes, when I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror, it felt like there was someone standing just behind me. I even left my phone recording one night while I slept, hoping to prove to myself it was all in my head. When I played it back the next morning, I heard breathing that wasn't mine, and a faint voice whispering, "Stay." That was enough. I packed my things the next day and left Coldwater without looking back. I never even told the landlord. I figured he'd figure it out soon enough. It's been years since then, but I still dream of that house. Sometimes, in those dreams, I'm back in the hallway, standing in front of that hidden door. I can hear knocking from the other side, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. And I know if I ever open it again, I won't come back out. I did not grow up near the ocean, so the first time I saw it, I expected some grand awakening. What I found instead in Damaris Cove, Maine, was a sheet of moving lead and a sky that looked tired of its own color. I went there because my uncle left me his shack on the edge of town. It wasn't much, a stove that coughed when you asked it to burn, a couch with a slant that made you feel like the world was slightly off level. But it had a view of the lighthouse if you leaned out the kitchen window and squinted between two hunched spruce trees. I told myself I would fix the place up, live simply for a year, save some money, and figure out who I was now that I had turned 30 and didn't recognize much of what I had planned at 20. People in Damaris Cove speak in short sentences. They don't waste words. The first afternoon I walked down to the dock to ask about part-time work. The harbor master nodded once at me and passed a clipboard across the counter. I signed up to haul traps for a man named Hal, who had a face like a hard winter. On my first day, he handed me gloves and said, "You'll bleed anyway, so don't act surprised when you do." He was right. My palms wore blisters the way the shore kept wearing waves. I slept like I had fallen down a well those first nights, all the way to the bottom. I noticed the lighthouse on the second week. Really noticed it. It stood on a low bulge of rock, maybe half a mile out. A white column with a black cap, not much different from the pictures you see on postcards. Only postcards never show a thing how it is. They don't show the way the light sometimes hesitated in fog, like a thought someone had almost forgotten. They don't show the way the gulls avoided the thing, curving around it like the air above it was wrong. I didn't know why that mattered, it just did. Damaris Cove has a diner named Nettie's that never got around to repainting, so the ceiling still wears the nicotine of 3 decades. The day the old man at the counter mentioned the lighthouse, I was nursing coffee and a plate of toast. "You staying in the Cutter place?" he said without looking up from his paper. I said I was. He nodded, slow, like that meant something to him. "When you hear it, don't answer," he said. Then he folded his paper, left $1 under the cup, and walked out. That sentence kept a finger in my mind all afternoon, pressing just enough to leave a mark. The first time I heard it was a Tuesday night. Rain like gravel slapping the windows, the harbor bells arguing with the wind. It was a knock, not at my door, not even on my house. It came from out toward the cove, a hollow, steady sound like knuckles on a wooden pail. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks. I got up from the couch and went to the kitchen window and pressed my ear to the cold glass. The sound carried and then died, like the sea took it back. I stood there for a long time, waiting for it to come again. It didn't, not that night. I went to bed and dreamed I was underwater, looking up through a ceiling of gray. At the docks the next morning, the men moved quieter than usual. Hal didn't talk at all until we were past the breakwater where the green water gets black. "Hear it," he said finally, not really asking. I said I did. He watched the horizon where the lighthouse sat like a marble on a plate. "If they knock," he said, "you keep your mouth shut. People who answer don't stay." He said it like he was telling me how to tie a bowline. I told myself there were stories everywhere and that old towns wore theirs like scars. People get nervous, invent patterns, pass them down. That afternoon, I walked the shore past the last cottage, past the rusted sign that said no trespass but clearly meant something else, toward the rocks nearest the lighthouse. The tide was low. I could have waded out to my knees and cut the distance in half, but even then, it would have been too far to swim without doing something foolish. The water had a surface like shivered glass, and below it, I thought I saw the faint shape of a road, stones set in a line leading nowhere, a trick of light that made my skin pebble even though the air was warm. Nettie's was full that evening, with men smelling of diesel and bait. I sat next to a woman I'd seen before, the one who delivered mail. She tapped the side of her nose with a red painted nail. "Full moon tomorrow," she said like a weather report. I said I hadn't noticed. She said, "You will." The old man who had warned me the first time was not there. When I asked Nettie, who was not actually named Nettie, she said he didn't come evenings. He kept to the daylight when he could. That night I heard the knocking again. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 knocks. And then something else. A far-off voice, thin as thread, pulled tight by the wind. It said my name. I felt every hair on my arms stand up. Not from fear at first, but from the nakedness of being known. I asked myself how you explain hearing your own name when you live alone and the neighbors don't even know it yet. I told myself it was a trick, a coincidence, a phrase that sounded like what I was most likely to hear because I was listening for it. Then it said my name again, more certain, the way my mother used to when she needed help carrying groceries in. I backed away from the window and turned on every light in the house. I ate dry cereal straight from the box and waited for the night to run out. Around 3, the fog crept in so thick the world outside the window was no longer there. That should have helped. It didn't. I lasted until the morning of the full moon. I didn't sleep. I didn't want to be asleep if it came again. I made coffee and drank it in sips like medicine. Around midnight, the fog arrived in a single movement, like someone pulled it over the town from the sea. The world became smaller than my living room. I could hear the buoy bell, but only as a memory of sound. And then the knocking started. 3 knocks, a pause. 3 knocks. It was closer this time, not from the cove, but from the yard, from the side of the house where the spruce trees leaned toward each other like old women sharing news. I stood up with my mug in my hand and walked to the front door. My heart climbed high, as if it wanted to see out first. I pressed my ear to the door. The wood felt damp, as if the fog had seeped through it. The knocking came again, careful and polite. On the other side of the door, a voice said my name once, softly, in the exact cadence my younger brother used to use when we shared a bunk bed, and he asked if I was awake. My brother is alive and living in Wyoming. I nearly said what? That single word floated up to the back of my teeth like a bubble and held there. "Don't answer," the old man had said. "If they knock, keep your mouth shut," Hal had said. I swallowed that word and went to the kitchen and turned on the radio and made it too loud. The knocking stopped. The next day, the town looked like it had been wrung out and left to dry. People walked slower. Even the gulls sounded tired. I asked the mail carrier if she had ever heard them say her name. She looked at me a long time, then folded her lips like she was holding on to something she didn't trust herself to let out. "They try what you love," she said. "That's how it works." Then she handed me a small yellow envelope with no return address. Inside was a Polaroid of the lighthouse taken from the exact angle of my kitchen window. In the lower corner, written with a wide marker, it said "Don't." When I went back to my place, I turned the picture face down. I left it on the counter, but I knew it was there, like, a splinter is still under your skin even when you can't see it. I had to work that evening, baiting lines, which is a kind of meditation if your hands don't mind smelling like death. By the time I came home, the moon had already risen, a bright coin in a washed sky. I told myself I could do one more night. I could not answer one more time. Around 1 a.m, the fog came back shorter, as if it had remembered something and needed to return quickly. The knocking started again, not on the door and not from the yard this time, but from the kitchen window. The sound was delicate, not like knuckles on wood, but like fingernails on glass. Tap, tap, tap. A pause. Tap, tap, tap. I stood at the sink with the faucet running and watched the black rectangle of the window. The tap came again, and the voice said it hurt. It said, "Help, please." It sounded like the first girl I ever loved, the one who left for Seattle and never came back, and who I hadn't thought about in years. And then, all at once, I was back on the riverbank, where we sat at 18 and made plans that could not survive the people we became. The voice said my name the way she used to when she was laughing. I turned the radio up until it was only static, an ocean of white sound in the room. I stood there while the tapping continued, small as a heartbeat. I wanted to answer so badly, my tongue ached with it. I put both hands on the counter and anchored myself to a world that still had rules. It stopped close to 3. I turned everything off, and the silence felt heavy, as if the house had been holding something at the door with me. I slept for an hour at the most. At dawn, I walked down to the shore. The fog had thinned, but not left. The lighthouse looked farther away, a pale bone balanced on the edge of the earth. On the sand, near the waterline, I found a trail of round impressions, like someone had walked barefoot out of the sea and toward town, but the spacing was wrong, too far apart for a person. I crouched and pressed my palm to one of the wet marks. It was cold enough to sting. I went to the library after work, because books sometimes make a thing less frightening by giving it a name. The librarian, whose hair was the color of steel wool, asked me what I was looking for. I said history of the lighthouse, as if I were a tourist. She led me to a shelf and tapped a thin volume put together by the Historical Society. It had a photo from 1927 of the lighthouse, with men in suspenders standing like reeds at the base. 3 men in front, a fourth just behind them, blurred, as if the camera had caught him mid-step. When I looked closer, I swear the blurred man was looking straight at me. I turned the page. There were clippings about a keeper who drowned in 1953, another piece about a storm in 1968 that knocked 2 panes from the lantern room, then a longer article about a boy who vanished off the rocks in 1975. In the margin, someone had penciled 3 knocks and circled it. I asked the librarian who had written that note. She squeezed her eyes at the page and shrugged. "That book's been around a long time," she said. "People write things they shouldn't in books." She didn't take it away from me, though. People also keep things they should share. When I left the library, the street smelled like rain and rope and fish scales. I cut down the alley behind Nettie's and almost ran into the old man who had warned me the first week. He looked at me like he had been waiting. "You heard them again," he said. I said I had. He nodded toward the harbor. "They don't want you, they want in. You give them a breath, they'll use your lungs for as long as they please." Then, after a minute, he said, "My boy answered." He said it like someone reciting a weather pattern. I didn't know what to say. He lifted a hand, and for a second I thought he might touch my shoulder, but he was just pointing at something over my head. "The gulls," he said. "You ever see them land on the light?" I said I hadn't. He said, "Birds know before we do." Then he walked around me and kept going without turning. That night was quiet. I didn't trust it. The quiet had the shape of a held breath. I left the radio on anyway. I left the lights on and sat at the table with the Polaroid flipped back over. I put my finger on the photograph lighthouse and pressed down until the paper bent. Sometime after 2, the house made a sound like someone leaning their back against it. Another sound climbed the chimney. Not a knock, not tapping, but a slow dragging like something pulling itself up from my uncle's old stove. I walked to the kitchen with a towel, thinking I could stuff the flue and stop whatever was coming in. I don't know why I thought towels could stop the ocean. When I reached for the latch, the voice slipped down like cool air and settled in the room. It was my mother's voice then, from the summer I was 10, the exact tone she used when she found me crying in the backyard because a neighbor's dog had been hit in the street. It said, "Honey, it's okay. Answer me so I know you're breathing." I closed my eyes and put the towel against the stove and stood there with my hands on that useless barrier while the tears came. Not because I believed it was her, because part of me wanted to, because the part that wants is the softest part, and these things, whatever they were, knew how to press there like a finger on a bruise. I waited. The voice kept asking me to answer. I did not. After a long time, the house unclenched and the chill moved back up the chimney. The room smelled like salt. After that, the knocking came less often, but the voices learned new names. They tried my father's, a teacher from high school, a man who used to work at the gas station where I bought cherry cola when I was 16. They were all close enough to pull me out of my chair and over to the threshold of answering. Each time I kept my mouth closed, I started to carry a note in my back pocket that said, "Do not answer," in my own handwriting, in case I forgot how to be myself for a moment and needed to be reminded by something I had written down when I was stronger. On the last night, the fog didn't come. The sky was clear, the way glass is clear, a clean blue that made the town look like a postcard again. I stood at the window on purpose and watched the lighthouse blink and hold and blink. It felt far away, and for the first time since I moved in, I believed I could leave in the morning, that whatever the place wanted from me, I had outwaited it. Around midnight, I heard footsteps in the yard, not quiet ones, not cautious. They crunched the gravel with the assurance of my own boots. The steps came to the door. There was no knock. The latch tried once, twice, then stopped. I moved closer. On the other side of the wood, a voice said my name in my own voice, maybe a half tone lower, the way I sound when I'm sick. It asked if I was there. It asked if I would let it in. It said we were tired of being two. I could hear it breathing. It matched my breath, just slightly out of sync, like an echo that had become a person. I stood with my hand on the doorknob and thought about what it would mean to open it, not just to let something cross a threshold, but to step back and make room for a thing that had learned the contours of my life and the way my feet felt when they hit the kitchen floor each morning. I took my hand away and walked backward to the table. I picked up the Polaroid and held it like a talisman, even though it offered no protection. Only the knowledge that someone else had tried to help. The voice on the other side of the door called me again. Then, as if it had to obey a rule I could not see, it left. The gravel receded. The night went back to the ordinary noises of a place that keeps living. I moved 2 days later. I left the shack better than I found it. Fresh paint on the window frames, a new latch on the back gate, the couch carried to the dump so no one else would have to sit on its crooked shoulder. I left the Polaroid in a drawer with a note that said, "When they knock, do not answer," so that the next person would not have to learn it the way I did. On my last morning, I walked down to the shore and looked out at the lighthouse one last time. A gull cut through the air between us and made a sound like laughter or like warning. The light blinked and held and blinked again. I wondered who was inside it, and if anyone had been for years, and if that mattered. I felt the old urge to wave, to be polite, and I kept my hands at my sides. Sometimes now, far from the coast, and sleeping with my window open to the kind of night that smells like dirt instead of salt, I will dream I hear that careful knocking from somewhere just beyond where the light can reach me. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 knocks. I wake up and hold my breath and wait for my name. It doesn't come. When the silence stretches long enough to believe in, I say my own name in my head, just to make sure I still know it. And then I let the dark go back to being only dark. I was 22 when I passed through Kearney Hollow, Missouri, on my way to somewhere that doesn't even matter now. I only meant to stay one night, but my car decided otherwise. It broke down just outside town, the kind of breakdown that makes every mechanic shake their head before they even pop the hood. Kearney Hollow had 1 garage, 1 bar, 1 motel, and a diner that smelled like fried onions no matter the time of day. It was late autumn, the kind that made every leaf look like something burning out. The motel clerk was a woman who didn't smile much, but offered me a key without asking for ID, room 6. The kind of room where the carpet never really dries after you clean it. The heater rattled like coins in a tin can, and the bedspread had the faint outline of someone else's head pressed into it. I remember thinking it was fine, just one night. Funny how people say that right before the kind of night that changes them. It started with the sound of whistling, low, tuneless, drifting just outside the thin wall between my room and the parking lot. I thought maybe another guest, someone walking their dog or smoking under the flickering light by the vending machine. I glanced through the curtain. No one was there, just the shadow of the overhang and a half-dead moth throwing itself against the bulb. The whistling stopped, then, 5 minutes later, started again, closer this time. I tried to sleep, but the whistling kept threading itself into my half-dreams, weaving in and out of my breathing. Around 2 a.m., I heard something drag across the gravel outside, slow and deliberate, like someone walking with one foot heavier than the other. I pulled the covers up like a kid, embarrassed even as I did it. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep because I woke to sunlight leaking through the blinds. When I went down to the diner for coffee, the waitress, a woman maybe in her 50s, asked if I was the one in room 6. I said yeah. She nodded like she expected that answer and said, "Don't open your window at night." I laughed. She didn't. "Why not?" I asked. "They come in through the air," she said. And that room's had enough of that. She poured my coffee and walked away before I could ask who they were. That afternoon, I walked around the edge of town while the mechanic worked on my car. The place looked abandoned, even though people lived there. Houses with curtains that never moved. Yards with toys that had faded to white from too many summers. Down by the river, the trees were gray and twisted, their roots like hands clutching the dirt. I found a rusted sign half buried near the water, city limits, Pop 214. Someone had scratched out the last number. That night, I couldn't help but listen for the whistling again. I told myself it was the wind through the eaves. It wasn't. Around midnight, it began, faint, circling the building, as if whoever it was knew exactly where I slept. Then came the tapping slow, deliberate on the glass of my window. I froze. The curtain moved slightly, like breath had pushed it. I didn't look. I just whispered, "Go away," before realizing I hadn't made a sound at all. The words had stayed stuck behind my teeth. The next morning, I asked the clerk about it. She sighed and said, "It's just the hollow. You'll get used to it if you stay long enough." "I'm leaving as soon as my car's fixed," I said. She just nodded. "That's what everyone says." By the third day, the mechanic still hadn't finished. He said something about a part needing to be shipped in. I didn't believe him. I sat in my room, reading an old newspaper someone had left in the nightstand. The headline was from 1982. 5 miners lost in tunnel collapse, rescue efforts halted. The photo showed a row of men covered in soot staring into the camera with hollow eyes. The caption listed names. One of them was Charles Carney, the town's namesake. Beneath the article, someone had written in pencil, "Still waiting." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the word waiting. Around 1, the whistling began again, soft and steady, like someone keeping time for a song only they could hear. Then, I heard my name not loudly, but like it had been breathed through a pipe. I sat up and stared at the curtain. The shape behind it was too still, too tall. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Then, from the wall beside me, came a faint rhythmic knock, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, as if someone in the next room was asking for help. I went to the front desk. No one was there. All the keys were hanging neatly on the board except for mine. Room 6. The others were coated in dust, as if they hadn't been touched in years. When I turned, I saw the clerk's chair still rocking slightly, like she had just stood up. I spent the rest of the night in my car, cold engine, windows fogged from my breath. The knocking came again, but now from outside, against the hood. A slow scrape moved across the metal, stopping right where my hand rested on the inside of the glass. For a second, I felt warmth, like someone was touching me from the other side. Then it was gone. At sunrise, the mechanic was waiting outside the garage with my car keys. "She's ready," he said. "How much do I owe you?" I asked. He shook his head. "Just go." I didn't ask questions. I drove until the town vanished behind me and the radio picked up something other than static. But somewhere around the county line, I realized I could still hear it faint. Underneath the hum of the tires, that same slow whistling. Now, Years later, I sometimes hear it again when I drive at night through quiet stretches of highway. It fades when other cars appear. As if embarrassed to be caught, I roll the window up and tell myself it's just the wind. But deep down, I know wind doesn't know your name. I was 19 the summer I lived in Marrow Creek, Idaho, a town stitched between two ridges where the forest leaned in close enough to hear you breathe. I'd gone there for work, forestry, maintenance, which sounded important until I realized it mostly meant clearing brush and fixing fences. There were maybe 36 houses, one grocery that sold more dust than food, and a church that rang its bell twice a day even though no one ever seemed to go inside. The kind of place that still looked the same in old photographs. The trailer they gave me sat at the end of a gravel path by the creek. The sound of water was constant, and at first it was comforting. Nights were cold, the kind that make you tuck your hands under your pillow. I'd fall asleep to crickets, to wind moving through trees, to that steady hush of running water. About a week in, I started noticing something strange. The creek didn't sound right after dark. During the day, it was just water and stone. But at night, it had rhythm like breathing, slow and deliberate. The first time I heard it, I laughed, told myself it was just the wind catching the surface, the forest playing tricks on my ears, but then it started whispering. It wasn't words at first, just the kind of murmur that makes you lean closer. I'd sit up in bed, hold my breath, listen, and I could swear I heard voices low, overlapping, like a crowd beneath the water. Sometimes a laugh, a sigh, something almost human. When I mentioned it to one of the locals, a man named Pete, who ran the supply shed, he said, "Don't go near the creek at night. It remembers." He wouldn't explain what that meant. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I took my flashlight and walked down to the water just after midnight. The air was still. My boots sank into the soft earth near the bank. I turned off the light and waited. At first, nothing, just the dark pressing against itself. Then, faintly, the whispering came back, clearer this time. I could make out my name. It came from the water, not echoing but bubbling up like it was part of the current. I stumbled back, slipped on a rock, and the flashlight rolled into the water. The beam stayed on under the surface, casting pale circles that shifted with the current. For a second, I saw shapes, faces, maybe, moving beneath, mouths open as if calling to me. I ran. The next morning, the flashlight was gone, but footprints, bare ones, led from the water to the edge of the path. They weren't mine. That day, the foreman told me about a flood that hit the valley back in '78. A landslide upriver had dammed the flow, then burst. 3 houses by the creek were taken, 12 people drowned, most never found. "So don't listen to it," he said. "The creek talks, but it ain't your friend." After that, I tried to ignore it, but the whispers followed. Sometimes I'd hear them while fixing fences miles away, faint and wet sounding, like breath through water. At night, they got louder, calling my name in tones that shifted between voices I recognized: my mother, my ex, my own. I started keeping the window shut even though the trailer turned into an oven. One evening, a storm came through, lightning without rain, the kind that sets the sky on fire but doesn't cool the air. The power went out. I sat on the floor with a candle, listening to the wind thrash the trees. Then came the tapping from under the floorboards, slow, steady, like knuckles against wood. The whispers followed, rising with the sound of rushing water. I went to the window. The creek had swollen, spilling over its banks, dark and fast, and in the middle of it, waist deep, stood a figure, pale, hair floating like roots, eyes wide open. It was looking straight at me. It opened its mouth and spoke, but what came out wasn't a word. It was the sound of drowning. I remember backing away, knocking the candle over, and the trailer filling with smoke before I even realized the curtain had caught fire. I grabbed my bag and ran out barefoot into the mud. When I turned back, the water had already reached the steps. The figure was gone. By morning, the creek was calm again, like nothing had happened. My trailer was still standing, blackened but intact. The foreman said it must have been lightning. I didn't argue. I just packed up and left that afternoon. It's been years, but sometimes when I'm near running water, even something as small as a gutter or a drain, I swear I hear it whisper again, soft, careful, patient. Sometimes it says my name, sometimes it doesn't say anything at all, just waits. I never believed in ghosts, not really. That was something my grandmother talked about when the power went out, a way to make darkness interesting. By the time I was 30, I'd lived in enough big cities to forget those stories, to forget that feeling of the world holding its breath. But then I took a job in Wyoming, a small town called Red Hollow, one of those places you find at the end of a road that seems to be going nowhere. Population under 200. Sky so big it made you feel smaller than you ever thought possible. The job was simple: oversee renovations of an abandoned school building set to become a museum. I was there for 6 weeks, maybe less. The building sat alone on a hill, surrounded by brittle grass that whispered in the wind. The locals called it the Bellhurst School, though the sign out front had long since lost the letters that made it legible. I remember the first time I stepped inside, the smell of chalk and rot, the echo of footsteps that weren't mine. I stayed in a rental cabin down the slope, about half a mile away. Nights there were silent, so quiet that my ears would start inventing sound just to fill the space. I could hear the wind breathing through cracks in the wood, the groan of old boards settling, and sometimes, if I left the window open, I swore I could hear the faint sound of a bell, soft, rhythmic, like a teacher calling the class to attention. The locals avoided the hill after sunset. They didn't talk about it much, but if I mentioned the school, their eyes would go distant. The hardware store owner, a heavy-set man named Carl, told me once, "Some places keep time differently. That's one of them." When I asked what he meant, he just said, "You'll see," and rang me up for the paint thinner I didn't even need. Work went smoothly during the day. I was there mostly alone, checking floors, inspecting the wiring, making sure the roof wouldn't collapse. The building was old but proud, the kind that carried its history like a secret. There were handprints still visible on the wall, outside one of the classrooms, children's hands, preserved in fading paint. I like to think it was part of a project they'd done once, before everything ended. It was the third week when I first noticed the chalkboard. Every morning it was wiped clean, but by afternoon, faint writing appeared. Not words, not exactly, more like marks, lines drawn over and over in the same spot until they dug into the surface. At first, I thought it was moisture or dust settling in patterns, but one afternoon I watched it happen. The chalk moved, slowly, as if guided by an invisible hand. I didn't run, I just stood there, frozen, my mind refusing to catch up with my eyes. The next day, I came back and found a single word written across the board. Stay. I told myself someone was playing a joke, maybe one of the workers coming in after hours, so I erased it. The next morning, the word was back, only this time it said, please. I stopped going alone after that. I brought my assistant, a kid named Theo who was young enough to still think the world made sense. We worked side by side, trying to ignore the noises that came from the upper floor, the sound of chairs scraping across wood, of faint laughter drifting down the stairwell. Theo joked that it was the ghost of education haunting us, and I forced a laugh I didn't mean. Then, one afternoon, Theo went missing. We'd been unloading tools from the truck, and when I turned around, he was gone. I called for him, checked every room, even went up into the attic where the air felt thick and cold. The sun was already dropping when I heard footsteps in the hallway behind me, light, quick, like a child running. I turned, but there was no one there, just the sound of giggling, faint and playful, echoing from classroom to classroom. I followed it until it stopped in front of the chalkboard. Written there, in big, uneven letters, was my name. Below it, smaller, "We're still here." Theo came back about an hour later, pale and shivering, his hands covered in dust. He said he'd gotten lost, that the halls kept turning back on themselves, that doors opened into the same room again and again. I wanted to believe he was just scared, maybe confused, but when we left that evening, the sky over the hill looked bruised, the sun sinking faster than it should have. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind had changed. It didn't move through the trees anymore. It howled like something trapped. Around midnight, I heard the bell again, not faint this time, but loud, insistent. I looked out the window toward the school. Every window in the building was lit, pale yellow light glowing from inside. There was movement, 2 silhouettes, small and shifting, like children running in circles. I don't know what made me go up there. Curiosity, maybe? Or the kind of pull that comes when you've already gone too far to turn back. I grabbed my jacket, took a flashlight, and started up the hill. The closer I got, the more I heard laughter, singing, the creak of desks being dragged across the floor. But the air was wrong. It didn't carry warmth or life, just the dry taste of dust and something old. When I opened the door, the sound stopped. Every light went out. My flashlight flickered but stayed on. The hallway stretched longer than it should have, lined with doors that didn't belong. Some were closed, some slightly open. From behind, one of them came a voice, soft, childlike. "We waited," it said. "You came back." I stepped closer. The door opened by itself, slowly, as if pushed by air. Inside, rows of desks sat perfectly aligned, each one holding a small bundle of papers, pencils worn down to nubs. And at the front, the chalkboard. Across it, written in broad strokes, were dozens of names, none I recognized, and at the bottom, one that hadn't been there before, mine. I ran. I don't remember how I got back to the cabin. I woke up at dawn, sitting on the floor by the bed, mud on my boots and dust on my hands. The lights from the school were gone. The bell was silent. When I returned the next day, the building looked empty again. Sunlight streamed through broken windows. The chalkboard was clean, no names, no marks, nothing. I finished my work, signed off on the final report. When I left Red Hollow, I promised myself I'd never go back. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is still and the air feels thin, I hear that same bell. It rings once, then again, and somewhere between those 2 notes, I can hear them, the laughter, the whispers, the faint scrape of chalk on slate. I tell myself it's just memory, but I keep my name off anything written down now, just in case someone, somewhere, is still taking attendance.